is Evelyn Owen. I'm the Associate Director of Curatorial Projects here at the Africa Centre. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this space where our mission is about transforming the world's understanding of Africa, its diaspora, and the role of people of African descent in the world. Thank you all for joining us for this program on African Modernisms, a legacy of connection. I'm very excited to hear from our three curators and our moderator in a conversation about creative exchanges between artists working in Africa and the United States in the 1950s to 70s, roughly speaking. And we're very grateful to the American Federation of Arts who've partnered with us to organize this talk and especially make it available to everyone joining remotely. So welcome to those people as well. Along with Fisk University Galleries, AFA co-organized the exhibition African Modernism in America, which you'll be hearing more about very soon. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers and our moderator for this evening. Perrin Lathrop joined the Princeton University Art Museum as Assistant Curator of African Art in 2002. She was previously postdoctoral fellow in modern and contemporary art history at the University of Maryland Phillips Collection, the Warhol Foundation Curatorial Fellow at Fisk University Galleries, and pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. Kimberli Gant is the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Brooklyn Museum. She was previously the McKinnon Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, and has also worked as Mellon Doctoral Fellow at the New York Museum and Director of Exhibitions at MoCADA here in New York. In Brooklyn, I should say. Yeah. And Lauren Tate Baeza is the Fred and Rita Richmond Curator of African Art at the High Museum of Art. Baeza is a scholar of African art and political history and previously served as the Director of Exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, where she curated the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection and organized numerous temporary exhibits engaging visual arts to address social issues. And our moderator for this evening, Seruberi Moses, is a Ugandan curator and author based in New York City. He currently serves as faculty in art history at Hunter College and visiting faculty at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College. And as a curator, he has organized exhibitions at museums, including MoMA PS1 in Long Island City, Kunstwerke Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, and the Hessel Museum at Bard College. So Moses, I'll let you introduce the topic for this evening and get the discussion started. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn, and thank you, Perrin, Kimberli, and Lauren. It's good to meet you for the first time, except Kimberli, who I know really well, I meet really well. It's a huge task to introduce these curators and their various projects, but which I will actually let you just talk about since you know them far better than any of us do. I will just preface that the linking factor between all three projects has to do with African American and African artists working from the 1950s, around there about, to the 1970s. The three exhibitions are very rooted in collections. There's a very strong relationship between the exhibitions and historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. We already heard about Fisk University. There's obviously a very strong conversation around the various travels that the artists have made, whether it's African artists coming to the United States or African American artists going to Africa. And so, for example, in Lauren's exhibition on Bruce Onobrakpeya, I think we can see how Dele Jegede, the art historian, really has set a precedent for you, and with his curation at Spelman College in the 1980s and his continued scholarship on Bruce Onobrakpeya. So I guess I don't want to speak for much longer. I think I'll only say briefly that the exhibitions are informed by a lot of scholarship, and it was daunting, to say the least, to try. I'll only say briefly that the exhibitions are informed by a lot of scholarship, and it was daunting, to say the least, to try and research these exhibitions because of just how many scholars have been involved in researching the subject. And so, welcome to the panel.
Is this okay? Is this on? Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here, and to the Africa Center for hosting us in October of last year. I'm a co-curator for the show. I worked on the exhibition with the director of Fisk University Galleries, Jamal Sheets, and former curator Niku Paidar. And as mentioned, we partnered with the American Federation of Arts to tour the exhibition, and it's now on view at the Kemper Art Museum at WashU in St. Louis, and looking very beautiful there, I have to say. In general, the show, African Modernism in America, is about the impact of cultural diplomacy on artists from Africa and the United States in the 50s and 60s during the civil rights movement in the US, decolonization across Africa, and the global Cold War. And I think it's also about the possibilities that emerge when artists from around the world are able to share the same space, and examines the growing commitment to Pan-Africanism among both African and also African-American artists in this era. So I've kind of put a few slides together that present the 4 sections of the exhibition. The first is called Art from Africa of Our Time. And this section is a sort of institutional history of the organizations, museums, and galleries in the United States that supported the display of work by artists from Africa in the post-World War II era. So one of the kind of primary characters of the show is the Harmon Foundation. And this here is the cover of their exhibition pamphlet for their 1961 exhibition, Art from Africa of Our Time, which was their attempt to survey contemporary art in this post-independence era in Africa. Another institution or set of institutions in the US that supported African artists was historically Black colleges and universities like Fisk University and also Howard University. So these are 2 paintings in Fisk University's collection by the artist from Nigeria, Ben Nwamwu, who was one of the first African artists to come to the US to tour, talk about his work, and exhibit his work. That was in 1950, and he held an exhibition at Howard University that was supported by the Harmon Foundation. Also, museums like the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, who in the 1960s began to collect work by African artists. This slide does not show a work in MoMA's collection by Ibrahim El-Salahi. It actually shows a work in the Africa Center's collection by El-Salahi, but shows connections between institutions like MoMA and collectors because it was a work that the MoMA curator, Dorothy Miller, advised David Rockefeller to purchase for the Chase Manhattan Bank collection in 1965. So, you know, kind of institutional history in the painting itself. And the picture on the right shows El-Salahi alongside Alfred Barr at MoMA. Our second section of the show is an overview of arts organizations that developed across Africa in the independence era. including the Mbari Artists and Writers Club in Nigeria, which I'm sure we will hear more about from Kimberli. And these two paintings by Uche Okeke, another Nigerian artist on the left, and Dema Sanwoko on the right, were in the first Mbari exhibition in 1961. And finally, not finally, sorry, our third section is called Modernism Between Africa and America. And it foregrounds kind of the cultural exchange between African and African-American artists, facilitated by the financial structures of the Cold War. For example, artists from America like John Biggers were supported by UNESCO grants to travel to West Africa in 1957, and he created work in response to that experience. And also many artists from Africa, including figures like Solomon Mwangboje from Nigeria and Mamo Tesema from Ethiopia, received funding to study at US universities. But on this screen, I'm gesturing towards the way that this section of the show spotlights Fisk University as a site of Black diasporic exchange under the directorship of the artist and art historian and curator David Driscoll. While Driscoll was chairman of the art department at Fisk, they received half of the Harman Foundation collection of modern African art, which was in 1967. And that collection is the centerpiece of our exhibition. And Professor Driscoll was really invested in cultural exchange and invited African artists to come to campus while he was a professor there for residencies and also to exhibit their work. And here is one of the really wonderful archival finds that we uncovered in the research process for the show. I have to call out Niku Paidar for finding this contact sheet in the archives at Fisk University Galleries, which it shows the Nigerian artist Lamidi Fakaye in April 1972 on Fisk University's campus doing a carving demonstration. But in kind of the center top, there are two images of a woman. And it turns out that these are images of the Nigerian ceramic artist Ladi Kwali, who also visited Nashville in April of 1972. So kind of within this one archival document encapsulating so much about the kind of exchange that we're foregrounding in this exhibition, and also, you know, the importance of research in institutions like Fisk and the many different, you know, documents of information of past time that are held there. Our final section is called The Politics of Selection, and this is actually a single art installation. We invited the Lagos, Nigeria-based artist Ndidi Dike to create a commission to activate the histories that we were telling in our exhibition. And she wanted to focus in her work on the persistent underrepresentation of women artists, even in kind of revisionist histories of modernism, like the one that we're telling in our exhibition. And so she created this archival collage called The Politics of Selection, based on research that she did in the Harman Foundation archives in Washington, D.C., and also Fisk University Special Collections. And she was here in the U.S. for about a month in January 2022 to carry out this research. And she created a study for the collage at Fisk. And the kind of background of her work that she builds this kind of world of individuals, especially women artists, on the 20 Naira note, Nigerian currency, which features the image of Ladi Kwali. So very, very powerful connections there. And I think with that, I will hand it off to Kimberli.
Thank you. So again, I want to just also echo my thanks for being invited and having this wonderful panel of conversations, because I think it's really a monumentous moment that these 3 shows are all traveling different venues across the country. And I really hope from this, y'all go see at least one of them. So the exhibition that I worked on is called Black Orpheus, Jacob Lawrence and the Mbari Club. And this exhibition came about in doing some research when I was a graduate student on Jacob Lawrence, and realizing, though I think we know his name and know a very minuscule amount of his practice, that the majority of people do not know that he traveled to Nigeria with his wife on a couple of occasions and actually created work from his time there, and so did his wife. And that kind of started a discussion and look at the work that was exhibited or presented in the journal Black Orpheus, which was a arts and culture publication founded in Nigeria. And I focus only on the kind of the first 10 years of the journal, from 57 to 67, though it continued kind of sporadically into the early 80s. And then the third kind of intersecting part of the exhibition is looking at the Mbari Artists and Writers Club, and how the kind of all 3 of these individuals and artists and moments were all intersecting. And so Lawrence is he's the kind of marquee artist of the show, but well, definitely not the only artist. The exhibition is organized into 5 sections. And so we kind of open with opening on a timeline, because obviously I wanted a lot of visitors to the exhibition to really look at not just the moments that are being spotlighted in the exhibition, but also the moments that we couldn't represent in the exhibition that were, again, as Perrin eloquently said, the cultural diplomacy, aspects of it, the Cold War, all of the other kind of meetings and organizations that were happening within this period across the continent and the rest of the world. So the exhibition opens into looking at Lawrence's time in Nigeria. He went for the first time in 1962 for 10 days. This was following, he had a solo exhibition of some of his war series, some of his migration series. And this had happened after he was in a group show to celebrate the opening of the West Africa Center for the AMSAC, for the American Society for African Culture, which had opened a space in Lagos in 1961, though it had been founded in the United States several years earlier, after the First World Congress of Negro Artists and Writers happening at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1956. So AMSAC starts in 1957. And is kind of considered they consider themselves the kind of American arm of the Society de African Culture. Again, it was a kind of an outgrowth of the World Congress organized by Allion Diop. And so AMSAC is happening in New York here at the time, and Lawrence and his wife were already a part of it. They kind of already knew. He'd been doing his own research on artists of his time on the continent, been going to exhibitions at MoMA, and the Met, been researching at the Schomburg Library, and was a member of AMSAC. So he was meeting artists like Ibrahim El-Salahi was coming in. So he already kind of had this kind of network of artists and had wanted to go. He's able to go in 62 as a result of this exhibition, just for 10 days. They show the work, and then Uli Bayer, who was one of the founders of the Mbari Club, sees the exhibition and travels that to Ibadan, where their headquarters are located, and extends it. So fast forward, they have an article of his work in Black Orpheus in 1963. And then, unfortunately, due to the issues with the Cold War and the belief from the US government that Lawrence was a communist sympathizer, and he'd already had an FBI file on him for like a decade at this point. So he couldn't get a visa. So luckily, power of women, his wife, a very important artist in her own right, and who was born in Barbados, was able, because it was both a British protectorate, was able to get a British passport and then a visa. And that's how they got to Nigeria in 1964 for 8 months, and was also there and being connected with a lot of the Mbari artists. So what I did in this first section is we brought together as many of the Nigeria series as possible. We were able to at least find where they all were. All the lenders didn't let us borrow them, but at least it's nice to know we know contemporarily where they all are, who owns them. So #winning. And then I added that in with some of his earlier work, Harlem series, the war series, and and original letters that we were able to find of him while he was in Nigeria, which was really exciting for me to know. And here's an example, a marketplace scene that while I was at the Chrysler, we were able to acquire for that collection. So very excited to have one more piece of Jacob Lawrence in a public collection. And then here's some of the original letters from that we were able to find, obviously on AMSAC paper. So that's nice. The exhibition continues looking at artists of Oshogbo, which is one of the 3rd cities in Nigeria that kind of make the trifecta of the places that the exhibition focuses: Ibadan, Lagos, and Oshogbo. And bringing a lot of the artists from the Mbari Club together. If you can kind of see, these kind of clickers. So kind of back there, we were also able to find the majority of the Black Orpheus journals in a private collection, and the lender was gracious enough to let us borrow them. And so using the journals kind of as a guidebook, we tried to present as many artists who had either had articles in the journals or had exhibitions through the Mbari Club and its sister organization, the Mbari Bio in Oshogbo. So trying to kind of bring and presenting a lot of these artists, which, as we all kind of know, a lot of audiences in the US names don't know. So Twin 77, Koledo Magbai, Susan Wenger, Chebud Afolabi, and so on and so forth. A 3rd section was the Zaria, the Zaria Rebels, Zaria's Artist Society, which came out of the NCAS University in Zaria, and wanting to really talk about the fact that though the exhibition is really focused on the Mbari Club and the artists related to Black Orpheus, that there were so many different arts organizations and communities happening outside of that. So this was giving another taste of what was happening beyond just the Mbari group. And then again, Black Orpheus, though it was founded to really present African literature, especially in kind of an English translation, the fact that a lot of the artists also weren't just from West Africa. We had artists from Central Africa, West Africa as well. So bringing and presenting some of the artists, like I said, Ibrahim El Salahi, Amid Shabreen, Malangatana from, oh my God, Mozambique, thank you. My brain just fried for a second. Trying to, again, just show the range and the circulation of the artists that were part of it and to show the kind of global presentation. And then finally, even beyond that, artists beyond the African continent, the journal was also presenting artists from Asia, India, Latin America, specifically Brazil, and of course, the United States. So really, again, just trying to show the kind of global connections of contemporary art that the journal and the artists were presenting and making.
So one of the things that I've really focused on since I've been talking about this exhibition is that this is an artist that is highly celebrated. He's one of the most well-known and honored artists in Nigeria, and he has a vast career that spans over half a century. And his career has resulted in all of these creative endeavors and expressions that are extremely dynamic. And the reason I take that seriously and feel a responsibility to always say that before I start talking about my exhibition is because this is his first United States solo exhibition at a museum. And so I understand that this will be an introduction for a lot of people into this artist. And I don't want them to come to my exhibition and think he's the Nigerian Christian artist. He is not. This is a very small chapter of the epic of this artist's life. And so I'm hopeful that this is the beginning of many more exhibitions about his work, exhibitions that get more into the depth and breadth of it, a proper survey, et cetera, in the future. I also, but before I move on to the exhibition, actually, I also want to talk a little bit about kind of what that means to have a career that long, over 65 years. Bruce Onobrakpeya is still alive. For those that don't know, he's 90 years old. He's very much alive. He's very energetic. I always joke about, I've visited with him about 5 times now at his home studio in Lagos, and he walks up and down these 3 flights of stairs, and I am panting and I can't keep up with him. And I'm like, half his age, so a little less than. And so, I mean, he's just full of life, and he's still creating, and he's making now massive sculptures out of car parts. I mean, he just keeps going. And that's just really important to know before I talk about this exhibition again. That's just a small example of his career, a small sample of all of the different media that he works in and all the different conceptual ideas that he's tried to express through series. I also want to say that, he because his career spans so long, it stretches across this fascinating time of political and cultural transformation for Black and African artists, Black American, that is, and African artists, such as the moments that are, more deeply investigated and interrogated in the 2 previous exhibitions mentioned. And in his life, he has intersected with many of the arts movements, artists, clubs, and schools that are also examined thoughtfully and engaged in the previously discussed exhibitions. He was an apprentice to Benin Wanwu. He was a Zaria rebel with Uche Okeke and Damas Mwoko, who are on Perrin's slide. He went to the Mbari artist programs. He studied printmaking at the workshops in Oshogbo. He talks to this day. Just 2 weeks ago, he spoke to the docents at the High Museum passionately about Ruven Rossum, and credits him with changing the trajectory of his entire career, because actually at Zaria, Bruce trained in painting, but became renowned as sort of the father of printmaking in Nigeria, and loves printmaking, and that is his primary medium. And he had been exposed to it, sort of cursory instruction on printmaking as an art student with a focus on painting. But it was Rue that introduced him to all these experimentations and different ideas about how to process things in printmaking that really excited Bruce and made him completely drop painting for about 10 to 15 years before he picked it back up and just became a printmaker. And so that's an important thing to discuss as well as we discuss these other 2 exhibitions, that's how Bruce kind of sits in this story. So I'll briefly walk through specifically which aspect of this 65-year career I've attempted to tackle with the mask and the cross. And that is this really interesting story that is little known and probably surprising to many of you to hear, but the role of the Catholic Church in sort of late colonial and early post-colonial Nigerian art. There was a missionary group that was working in Nigeria, and first Ghana, then Nigeria, whose missionary work was expressed through these arts projects. And they were from the Society of African Missions based in Cork, Ireland. There are a few locations, but these were specifically from Ireland. And they would commission artists, craftspeople, trained people like Bruce, generations of carvers, people like Fakaye, to do these expressions of Catholicism, Catholic motifs, or just Bible stories more broadly. And they were encouraged to express it in a way that, was culturally appropriate to them, or that utilized what they knew of their own sort of aesthetic values and practices that they were already engaged in, and then to just apply those practices and methods to these subjects. And so because of that, there's this interesting engagement that the Catholic Church has, or this interesting relationship that the Catholic Church has with sort of funding the early careers of artists working at that time, at this really important time, again, for political and cultural transformation. And Bruce is one of those. And so this exhibition really focuses on not only that story, projects like the Oye Ekiti program in St. Paul's Church, but 2 very specific commissions that Bruce was given. by the Catholic Church, especially as brokered by Father Kevin Carroll. When I was, I'm new to the High. I've only been there about a little over 2.5 years, I think. And before I proposed anything in terms of a collection strategy for the museum or exhibitions, I was really just trying to learn the collection, right? I didn't have it. I mean, I saw things online and I had books and all of that. And I'm from Atlanta and I had experiences going to the galleries, but I didn't know it. You know, there's so many things that aren't documented. There's no photographs, you know, sometimes that stuff doesn't always get done in institutions. And so I tried to go through and look for everything I could find and understand where we had arrived so far in the collection history since 1953, which is when they got their first objects. And I found these incredible prints. So the first commission that Bruce got from the Catholic Church was to do a mural. It was in 1966. He was asked to interpret Jesus Christ's Passion story. That is the story of his condemnation and sentencing, his walk, his march, his being crucified and his being taken down and laid in tomb. And it was to go around the entire perimeter of a church on the ceiling. And he did that commission. And then later on, about a year later, he used the studies, maybe more, yes. He used the studies, the drawings and the references that he made preparing for the large mural installation to make a series of prints. And they're these beautiful detailed prints, brightly colored, some of them muted but still rich. And they're lino cut prints on rice paper, and they have like almost a texture-like quality to them, like a, not texture, I mean textile-like quality. They look almost like textiles. And we had all 14, so we had this entire narrative series of prints, and we had an early edition 4 out of 50. And so I thought this is an interesting way to showcase something really incredible in our collection, something surprising in our collection, perhaps to some. And I'm going to follow that through line and tell a story about Bruce's engagements with public Bible stories and Catholic motifs. And so that's what this section of the exhibition is. It's just the first section of 3. And here's a close-up of one of the 14 prints in the exhibition. The second of 3 chapters of this exhibition, Mask and the Cross, focuses on a commission that he was given in 1968 to illustrate a text, a children's textbook for the National Catholic School System program. And it was for 5th and 6th year primary school students, and it was called May Your Kingdom Come. And in working with Bruce, we were able to find there's 60 illustrations in the book, all by Bruce. And we were able to find the artist proofs. This is a very special section of the exhibition because it is so rare. There's one of one for these. They were never intended to be shown. In fact, he had to, in 2021, go and sign them all because they were stapled with the, you know, from the print shops and from the packaged places. And it was never meant to be seen. They had a little bit of damage, and our incredible conservation team restored them all, framed them. They're beautiful. And we also were able to, with a lot of work, find the book, the actual original textbook, a retired professor from SOAS had in his collection, as well as the teacher's manual for that book, all these years later, 50 years later. And so those are on display as well in the second section, a close-up of one of the prints in that section of the exhibition. And here you can see again, this distinctly Nigerian aesthetics and design, and in the settings that Bruce is placing the characters in as he interprets these stories from the Bible. There's also an interesting thing happening in a number of the prints where it's evident to me that this is in the early post-colonial period, where there's this idealized sort of notion of a new Nigeria that is sort of this multi-ethnic utopia. So he's got something distinctly Urhobo in it, and then something distinctly Yoruba in it, and then something Igbo, and he's put it all in one piece on purpose, right? There he's not only layering and expressing sort of this multiple belonging or double belonging with Christianity in Nigeria, but then he's complicating what Nigeria means to him. And then the third and final section is not the commissions, but it engages the ways that Bruce continues to revisit on occasion Catholic motifs or Bible stories in his work. The works in the last galleries span from 1975 through this year. He reproduced something in 2023. And what I really love about this section of the galleries is that it really engages something that's very characteristic of him in his career. And that is that he is a very process-centric artist. So for him, he'll easily reuse plates, matrices, he'll draw the same things over and over again because he treats it in a unique way so that it is different regardless of the fact that he's reused a plate or he's reused a drawing. And so in the exhibition, for example, there are 3 different versions of the Last Supper. And as you can see, they are completely different. And there's also 3 different versions of sort of the mother and child, Jesus and Mary motif, and so forth in this space. And so this one really talks more about his technique and encourages the audience to look at his approaches and his experimentations as a legacy of Ruben Rossum and so forth.
Okay, that was, thank you all so much. I guess we can, before opening up for a Q&A, I think I'm really interested in getting into a few aspects of your shows. Oh, I don't have any slides. Yeah. I'm one of the aspects that I'm actually interested in is something that you've already touched on in your presentations, which is like what kind of institutional structures sort of supported these artists, whether here or in Nigeria. Yeah, Perrin, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we're drawing out in our exhibition is some of the shifts that happen, even in just the kind of 2-decade period that the show examines. So, for example, I'll talk about Ben and Nwamwu. So he was interested in coming to the US. He first contacted Charles S. Johnson, who was the first Black president of Fisk University in 1947. And he was laying the groundwork for visiting the US. Finally was able to come in 1950, actually with the support of the British Information Service. We were, colonialism was still present in Nigeria, and then the US State Department. And the Harman Foundation was an organization that was founded earlier in the century in the 1920s and is primarily known for their support of African-American artists, especially in the Harlem Renaissance. But in the post-World War II period, there was a shift in their research into artists, and they began to focus on artists from Africa. And so because of their strong ties to different Black institutions in the US, they were seen as an appropriate interlocutor to help Ben and Nwamwu when he came to the US in fall 1950. And in that moment, the director of the Harman Foundation, Mary Beatty Brady, she contacted lots of different organizations, museums in New York, trying to find venues that would be receptive to an exhibition of this artist's work. And in particular, she contacted the MoMA curator, Renee de Harnoncourt, who at that time completely dismissed Nwamwu. He wrote to Brady that he knew everything about, contemporary art making in Africa, and that nothing good had come out of Africa in the last 50 years, and anything that was coming out now was just derivative of Europe. And so that kind of gives you a good sense of what a particular kind of audience was thinking and when they were confronted with the work of an artist like Ben Nwamwu. And so then, 10 years later, 1960, MoMA does acquire their first work by a contemporary African artist, the artist from Tanzania, Sam Joseph Ventiro. And so just to, mention, the shifts that happen. And so instead of holding an exhibition of Nwamwu's work in 1950 at a place like MoMA, the exhibition of his work was instead held at Howard University at, their esteemed prestigious gallery in Washington, D.C., where the work found an incredibly receptive audience among the community there at the university and also in D.C. And so just to mention the shifts that happen and that you understand when you're able to take a close look at a particular moment in time.
Kimberli, do you want to?
Sure. I'll just add kind of as what I've, said before. So in addition to, Fisk having a lot of half of the Harmon Foundation, Hampton University, which is close to where Chrysler Museum is in Norfolk, Virginia, they have also half of it. And so I was able to borrow from there. So again, emphasizing the importance of HBCUs and just supporting artists while they were alive and continuing. And that's often where you are finding the early work. So you're finding really the core of an artist kind of practice as they're kind of young men and women. AMSAC itself, based here in New York, they're supporting bringing artists here, sending artists to the continent, book exchanges, political conversations, writing. So there's a lot of, I think, and again, at this moment is also about, as Perrin articulated, the cultural diplomacy aspect. We've got the Cold War going on. You have so many countries on the African continent that are now independent. And so you've got the Soviet kind of countries and Soviet governments and the US governments really vying for power and vying for who is going to kind of control the political schema, the economics of it, and how can we make those allies and relationships. So being able to support through artistic interventions, is that kind of soft way in which they're able to do that through, kind of exchanges and conversations. So, I just think kind of adding to that, it's, much part of this just larger political project. Whether or not I think the individuals in the organizations and the artists themselves knew or were worried about it, I think is a different question, because ultimately what was so important about these organizations for their very flawed situations, and then you can get on to Congress Cultural Freedom, they at least provided opportunities. And I think the artists and the organizations took what they could from those opportunities, despite, not all the hands are clean, but when you have limited opportunities and resources, and you've got museum art, administrators saying like, there's nothing good there. Others are going like, actually, that's not true. So let's figure out ways to utilize that.
Yeah. And Lauren?
I mean, my exhibition obviously is monographic, and it's looking at a very specific thing. And I already talked about the Catholic Church literally commissioning, most of the show through these interesting sort of art programs as a way of doing missionary work. But it is worth mentioning, and I didn't say it, I don't think, that Bruce's work is in both of their shows. So yeah, he's all accessing funding, not only from the Catholic Church, but from the same sources that they're talking about in their exhibitions, in the same sort of dynamic of the Cold War and this vacuum created when colonialism ends, and it's which way are these new independent countries going to go, and how do we, very, very overtly, and then other times more implicitly through the arts, or more passively through the arts, stake our claim. So he's getting funding from the same sources as well to practice his art.
Yeah, thank you. I think have some other general questions. I think you've kind of touch on like almost all my questions.
Sorry.
I feel like I should go get more questions and come back. Perhaps the audience has more. But I had a question also about the way that America, informs, African artists. So I wonder if you could talk about that. I mean, I'm thinking about, yeah, of course, from the 40s, onwards, maybe even earlier. I mean, I think these artists started coming to the US, I think, possibly even in the 20s. I mean, I know in the UK, that's the time period that you have a lot of African artists going there. So could you talk about the influence of the US on these artists?
Yeah, there's a lot potentially to say, but I think that there was a particular interest among at least the artists whose work I've engaged with developing a Pan-African audience for their work. And so for a lot of artists, I think that was what was as a special kind of motivation for wanting to come to the United States. And not all of them were able to come. My project started really with my research on a different artist from Nigeria named Akinola Lashekan, who was the first artist from Africa to contact the Harman Foundation, actually in June 1947. And he had ambitions to come to the US, but never was able to make it. But even when even when that travel doesn't happen, there's still a kind of circulation of information that's possible. And so because of his contacting the Harman Foundation and others in the US, he then received information. Like, for example, Harman sent him their publications on the sculptor Richmond Barthé, and he became incredibly interested in his work. He was in contact with the founder of the Associated Negro Press, which was a syndication service for Black newspapers, named Claude Barnett. And through Barnett, he became subscribed to the Pittsburgh Courier, which is a Black newspaper that in their editions, they had a section that was called Your History, that profiled different important people from the African diaspora from across time. And I think that exposure to that column really motivated this artist, Lashekan, who continued to reside in Nigeria, to be able to tell about important histories coming from Nigeria to a Pan-African artist, to kind of be able to contribute to that to that circulation of information. So even when artists couldn't come, I think that there's still a way that that this information circulation is impacting the work that they do. And I also wanted to mention in a different way, there Ibrahim El-Salahi's, whose work I showed, did come to the US on a number of occasions. But there was also another Nigerian artist who studied at Zaria at the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology with many of the artists, including Bruce Onobrakpeya, but wasn't a part of the Art Society, named George Talabi. And he actually came to the US in 1963 to study at MICA in Baltimore. And there was an Ibrahim El-Salahi exhibition at MICA, or at Morgan State, during the time that he was here, and he was then exposed to the work of another African artist in the US who he might not have, been able to at least interact with their work from Nigeria. And you can clearly see a shift in the way that he is thinking about painting from his art school days in Zaria to then the work he created in the US that incorporates, kind of surrealism and biomorphic forms that I would argue, he was exposed to with seeing El Salahi's work. So I think there's lots of ways you could answer that question.
Thank you.
I mean, I'll just kind of give another quick example. Like Vincent Kofi, who is a Ghanaian artist that's in the exhibition, he and known primarily for his wood making sculptures. He was able to kind of come and work and study at Teachers College at Columbia University in the 60s. And, instead of working in wood, he worked in metal. So there's so many artists, I think, that ultimately, whether it was United States or Europe, because a lot of the artists in our exhibitions also studied in London, in Paris. It's all, I think, as we all kind of know, a product of the kind of colonial understanding that you will have access to artists, materials, knowledge that you cannot get where you're from. And so that we know that's not the case, but I think there was still that moment of just like you had to go, you want to be part of the contemporary art world of that time. You had to go to Europe, you had to go to the United States because they weren't coming there. Unless it was specific artists and specific people. So I think ultimately what it just enabled, artists to do was meet each other, and be influenced by each other, experiment, and again, just have kind of different levels of access.
And I'll just add that just as they have access to other artists, other exhibitions they might not have seen where they're from, there's archives here and in libraries that have completely different types of materials in them. And so I know that a number of artists, Bruce included, would come to the United States and have a Fulbright or some sort of artist residency program that they were in or accepted into, and they would spend a lot of time not just making or meeting other makers and artists, but spending time reading and going through archives and being inspired by narratives and histories they didn't have exposure to, at least not to the same extent where they were, because as Kimberly said, not a lot of people were going there, especially then. And so they had to go out to go and find sort of these great collections and bodies of work from all over the world, which they could more easily find in Europe and the US. But
I just say,
Yeah.
I just want to call out your inclusion of Vincent Kofi's Awakening Africa in Black Orpheus, which, he's an artist whose work I don't think is in any other collection in the US other than Hampton University's collection. And so just the rarity of being able to see his work and you having it on view in that show, I just want to make sure I call it out.
We love each other. I'm so proud of each other. Thank you.
Okay, and then this is my last question before we open up. I mean, I had a couple of like bigger questions, but I do want to talk about David C. Driscoll for a moment, because I think that he is a very important figure in shaping exhibition histories. Those of you who don't know, David C. Driscoll curated the exhibition 2 Centuries of African American Art. That exhibition was very influential. In fact, it became, in my view, a model for Okwe and Wezora's The Short Century, which was also trying to have like a very large kind of historical overview. And so I just wanted to mention him also because he went to Africa. He obviously had a lot of influence on curators working today, like Deborah Willis, Larry Stokes Sims, and undoubtedly, I mean, I'm calling him up also because of the fact that I think that his work precedes the work that you're doing right now. So could you talk about Driscoll?
I mean, yeah, he's central both to, I think, conceptions or like conceit of the show and the type of work we're trying to do, and also to the actual exhibition, because he was the head of the art department at Fisk University from late 1966, I think, before he went to UMD. And so he's the reason really why the Harmon Foundation gave half of their collection to Fisk University, because Professor Driscoll had a relationship with Mary Beatty Brady preceding that. And, you know, in addition to him having the foresight to take in this collection at Fisk University and to be a steward of it and to understand its importance, he also created space, you know, on campus for international exhibitions, invited artists from Africa like Peter Clark from South Africa, and Lamidi Fakaye, in addition to many others, and created a kind of also cultural exchange program for Fisk students to travel to Africa. And so he, I think, really understood the importance of bringing people together and creating that institutional space. And we were incredibly fortunate, Jamal Sheets, my co-curator, and I, to be able to go and interview Professor Driscoll in his home in November 2019. He passed away in early April 2020. So he is, you know, casts a long shadow in terms of everything that the exhibition is doing, and to be able to also include his voice in our exhibition publication. We published the interview with him there. I think, yeah, speaks volumes.
Yeah, thank you.
Driscoll doesn't have a direct relationship to my exhibition project, but again, I think just other than kind of saying he is one of many scholars who have come before us and hopefully will come after us, that not only recognize the importance of cross-transnational conversations, especially in communities where they were not getting the attention they deserved, but also that it was part of a previous legacy, I think, of, again, as we said, as African-American artists and scholars who have gone to the continent and wanted and saw the relationship to their own practices, but also wanting to make those, I think, connections to their own personal legacies and giving them, you know, giving yourself the permission to say, I'm an African-American, I have a direct connection in some sort of way to the continent. It may be more now what that is, you know, I mean, even my own family, like, I don't know, but I think just making that, again, that shift of, I'm giving myself the permission to say this and make that relationship prevalent and to the forefront. And in the catalog, we have an essay by Dr. Leslie King Hammond, and she kind of touches on some of the other scholars and artists who have spent time, African-Americans who's like spent on the time on the continent, dating back to the 19th century. And again, it just touches on so much more scholarship needs to be done, that this is just a sampling and a tasting of what, you know, not even knowing the legacy of Driscoll, but knowing his legacy, but that moment of his legacy, you know, I don't know that well. So there's just so much more to be done there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and that exhibition, of course, came to the High, and the High Museum has the Driscoll Prize, which honors an artist or scholar of African descent. In fact, the gala for the prize is this Friday. But I was going to say that I think aesthetically, a lot of his work is so effective in building that bridge between Africa and Black American aesthetics and ideas, philosophies. We've been talking about this bridge before this talk, this sort of seamless connection of Black America and Africa in the mid-century that we think we've gotten away from a little bit, and we're dusting it off and walking back across the bridge because it's still there. But I think his work is that personified, I mean, in a tangible way, this sort of memory of these really strong connections and engagements politically, culturally, and artistically that were happening from the 40s to the 70s. And I hope that we have them again at that same volume and maybe without the problematic funders.
Well, thank you so much for these amazing presentations. I'll open up to questions from the audience. Yes.
Good evening. First of all, my name is Doba Afolabi. I'm an artist, I'm a painter. It's like coming in here tonight. I mean, it's like it's God ordained because I was not invited. I just came in here to drop my flyers because I'm having a show at City College. Now I'm so happy to hear about myself here. I school in Ahmadu Bello University. And most of these names you're mentioning were my mentors. Actually, Bruce, I saw last in 1989 in Apapa, Lagos, with Ben Enwowu before he passed, Gani Odutoku, David Dale, and all of them. So Mushi was my home with Baba Onobrakpeya, and I'm so happy to hear all these things before my eyes here. Regarding some basic stuffs here, like the acculturation of Father Carol. I mean, when he came and he said, we should be having our stuff in like manners from the religion. We have to acculturate it. We have to let our people know that Mary could be a Yoruba woman. You know, I think it's something very close to Santeria. You know, the concept of what actually brought about Santeria. And another thing I noticed was the mention of the cross. A lot of people actually attribute cross to Christianity. But in my background in Yoruba, cross simply means the 4 cardinal points of the world, and it has been with us from time immemorial. So, you know, some people may not see from that context. So when you say crosses, it's not actually basically or originally attributed to Christian alone. African had it way long before. Now we can even see it in symbols of some Ghanaian symbols and stuff like that. Yeah. So yeah. Then the issue of the printmaking, of the influence of Bruce on Bruce Onobrakpeya, who I actually shared the same studio he used in Ahmadu Bello University. Now, if there's anything I missed, then it was printing, because we didn't actually have elaborate print studio. All I understood, even in my undergraduate years, was like, if I have to print, I have to cut some plastic and roll some whatever on it and stuff. That's just the only thing I knew. But this man was so great that he introduced a lot of all these technologies and stuff like that, you know, that actually even influenced me too when I came to United States. And coupled with all this technology and mechanical environment I found myself, everything changed about the way, even my figures changed and everything. And that's why I call my new show Kinetic Terrain. It's going on now in City College. So yeah, thank you so much.
Laura.
I just want to make sure I heard you. So you went to the same school?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It used to
Yeah, it used to be called, it changed. Yes, of course. Yeah. That's wonderful. No, I don't have anything to add, but thank you for sharing.
We see the former director, the former curator at the High Museum. Yes.
Yeah.
You don't have a, I'd love to hear from you. But is there
I would too, actually.
Yeah, I would.
I would love to learn more about, I mean, I've talked to Steve, but I'd love to know anything you know about how that acquisition came into the clay. It's so beautiful, that acquisition.
You know, I just got a call
Okay.
from, and it was, I don't remember exactly the context.
I think it was Steve, the son of a diplomat who just died, had the work. That's how I understood it. Naife, yes.
Yeah, but I thought he had some connection to Hollywood or filmmaking.
Oh, I don't
Los
know that. Tell me
Angeles.
more.
Anyway, but when I first arrived in Atlanta, I became friends with so many different people, but including Bruce Onobrakpeya's daughter.
Kabari.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when I lived on Morningside, my first apartment in Atlanta, Bruce and his wife came to visit and I made dinner for all of them. So yeah, Mbari became a good friend. So
Wonderful.
I'm glad you found the works and created a project.
Yeah. Thank you for acquiring them.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question. A question in the back.
Hi, thank you for all those. Like, I think it's really interesting how African modernism is being reframed as a transnational project. And I'm wondering if these kind of interactions and relations and the kind of bridge you talked about, if that's something that lasts throughout the 70s and 80s, or if it's something that kind of dies out. And if so, what would be the reasons for that?
Okay, that's a
Tough
dissertation,
one.
right? It's so, I mean, I think again, it's another shift. I mean, you also, I mean, thinking specifically in Nigeria with the, the Civil War, the Biafran War, that kind of, I think, makes a break of things. But I think, you still have Festac, so you still have so much happening there. I mean, the conversations and the exchanges don't die. They simply, like with everything, move again. So it's just, I think, a matter, I mean, you have a lot of money that flows into Nigeria with like the oil, so that brings in a lot of artisan conversations. You still have other journals that are also producing and circulating. So it's, I'm not sure how to quite answer that other than, I don't think it doesn't die. It just,
Transform.
right. Thank you. I was like, I didn't want to say shift again.
The spirit doesn't die, right?
Right.
Like, obviously, creatives are going to create, but I do think the way that it is expressed changes with political change in some really important ways. I mean, I don't want to get on a platform or be added to another list, but I'm sure I'm on a couple already. But I just think the time of structural adjustment programs, American imperialism, the also known as the sort of dictatorship era, importantly changes the way that people produce because it changes the way that they think and live.
And I might also add, so the kind of unofficial dates of the exhibition that I worked on are 1947 to 1967. And we do cover, the events that David Driscoll, facilitated at Fisk kind of extend beyond that. But I do, at least in terms of this idea of the impact of cultural diplomacy of a particular moment on exchanges, I think there's a change, 1968 creates a different context, especially, in terms of the Black arts movement, Studio Museum founded in that year. And so I think there's also changes in terms of the institutions supporting the kind of transnational and diasporic work that that our exhibitions are telling.
Yeah, and then I'll finally just add that, so the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is one of the arms that the government uses to afford a lot of, to kind of pay a lot of these organizations, that gets kind of outed as a, kind of arm of the CIA in the 70s. So that like breaks apart a lot of these organizations in the sense of now finding out. So I think in certain situations, there becomes a lack of trust. And so again, maybe the organizations lose kind of the reputations, but the conversations with artists and the engagements or, artists going to HBCUs, like that still continues and happens as well.
Yeah, I also want to say just a little bit that, the other exhibition, which would be an accompaniment to your exhibition, Kimberli, would be on transition. And transition left Uganda in 1971 or 1970, precisely when in Uganda that cover was blown. I don't know who blew it so early, but it was blown by 1970 in Uganda, and that's why he was detained, and then the magazine was ordered. He had to leave, and that the editor, Rajat Nioji, lived with that trauma his entire life because he didn't know that it was funded by the CIA. I think, is that all the time we have, or? Okay, one more, yeah. Oh, I want to say just a little bit something else in relation to what Lauren was saying. The curator, BC Silva, talks about the idea of a descent into mediocrity, and it's related to structural adjustment. It's, when you bring in all these strong men, all the intellectuals flee, they all, leave. They might, huge. And the artist Christian Nyampeta, I really think that if you don't know him, look for him. Christian Nyampeta from Rwanda, he's based here in New York. He writes about exile as a major experience of African artists and intellectuals and philosophers that is overlooked. Like, apparently we don't talk about exile as part of the African experience. Anyway, any other questions? Nyampeta, N-Y-A-M-P-E-T-A, and he writes an essay called In the Color of Night, or In the Black Color of Night, which is about philosophy and exile. And specifically, he's thinking about how when the Rwandan genocide happened in 1994, like philosophers in Rwanda for 50 years had never written a single text about exile, even though Rwandans had been fleeing Rwanda as long as there had been conflict happening in that country since the 50s. So it's a very critical issue when you think about even the context of Nigeria, when you have not only Olusegun Obasanjo, but other, despotic rule, it really leads to a situation where people flee, but I don't know why, it's a question mark. Yeah.
In some flee, right? Certain classes of people can flee, right? And the rest are just suppressed, right?
Exactly. And I wonder about Bruce and some of the artists that you have in your shows, because I'm sure that in Nigeria specifically, and in Ghana especially, were, really oppressed or suppressed under that. But do we have more questions? Yes.
I really enjoyed the talks. It's really wonderful. Other than Gwendolyn Knight, I like the connection that you made as far as the role that women played in supporting and other roles. I was wondering, can you elaborate, were there any other women artists of the period or women who played a part in some of the work?
Yeah, I'll add in the exhibition, and in the catalog, we specifically have an essay that's looking at some of the women that were very connected with the Mbari Club. So Kolado Magbe, who is one of the the artists that kind of gets written about the most in relation to that as a female artist. Susan Banger and Georgina Bayer are the other two. We also have, and like I said, Gwendolyn, who is also another important artist who's, one thing we couldn't find that I hope if people are out there and you think you might have a work, please let me know. She did a lot of work in Nigeria as well while they were there, but I've never been able to find it. So I don't know if it was like she destroyed it or, there's images of them exhibiting together there. And there's an image of her by her work and him by his work. And so We know where his is, but I'm wondering if I'd love to go back to just do more research and see if there's there. So those just relation to my exhibition. And then in the journals themselves, there's there's a lot of female writers in the journals, and they had so many early poetry, short stories, plays written in the journals. So like so much meat is in there that these writers need a lot more recognition too.
I think I would say that the other side of it is, again, like In Transition magazine, where you have similarly James Baldwin, and you have a lot of crossover and engagement, but you have artists like Teresa Musoke, and you have novelists, for example, from South Africa. I'm forgetting her name actually. But you have different, Bessie Head was writing from South Africa at that time as well in the 50s.
Yeah, and I'll just list some of the women artists in in my exhibition because I think it's important to say their names. Grace Kwame, who is the mother of an artist, Ata Kwame, from Ghana. Estella Manyolo from Uganda, Afiekong from Nigeria, Ola Yinka or Miranda Bernie Nicol from Sierra Leone, Etso Clara Budaga Ngu, Nigeria, who taught at the what's now Amadou Bello University in Zaria. Lottie Kwali, and an American artist, Viola Wood, who was really impacted by the work of Lottie Kwali. And, those are a handful of names in about 50 artists that are in the exhibition. And so that we really did want to call attention to that discrepancy with the work that Ndidi Dike created in relation to the exhibition. And she, puts their names in the collage that she made, puts their faces, the work that they created within this context to really call attention to the gaps in knowledge that, we hope to be able to repair.
Yeah, and I just want to add, and you said this, Kimberly, but the works end up being so hard to find. Of these women, we know their names, they've been documented, we've seen the writings, we've seen photographs, but then when you try to locate the works, it's harder to find them. When I saw your show, Perrin, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm looking at an Ukbudaga because I'd never seen one. And I've been reading about her, but I never saw one before. It's, so they're out there, we know their names and we're looking.
Yeah, and just to call attention to an exhibition that's at the Newark Museum right now, Delphine Fawundu, a New York-based artist, has put her work in conversation with another artist from Sierra Leone, Ola Yinka, whose work is in the Newark Museum collection. And there are many works by her in this show. So it's a really wonderful opportunity to be able to see two women artists, across generations in conversation. Yeah. The Newark Museum in New Jersey. Yeah.
I mean, she's definitely relevant, but and so important. She is not in the exhibition. That doesn't mean she's not relevant. And there were certain artists that I couldn't put it. We just didn't have enough space to put every single person in too. Because that's the other problem is like when you're working on an exhibition, it started to get so large that it was like, wait, I have to kind of I have to make some sort of framework. I think you all do when you're working on a show. You have to make enough framework that you can actually get it done. But I mean, Nike is a goddess.
Yeah. And I also just want to say we recently collected Nike's work at the museum where I work, Princeton University Art Museum. So she's now represented.
Yeah, and I will add, I keep trying to keep pointing out the work that you've done at the High Museum, a very important work. But I know that you collected a number of South African women artists there as well, and that deserves, yes, Nandifam Tambo, and that deserves a lot of recognition. So thank you for your work there as well. And thank you. Okay, I think that is.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you again to AFA for partnering on this program. Thank you Lauren, Kimberly, and Perrin and Moses for the presentations and the wonderful conversation. Thank you for all the questions.
Can I say one, sorry, I should have said, so my show is currently at the New Orleans Museum of Art. If you're gonna get to New Orleans before it ends May, I think 6th or 7th, whatever, that Sunday is the first Sunday of May. And then it will be going to the Toledo Museum of Art, opening in June, going through August. So places to go.
I'll plug next. The Mask and the Cross is at the High Museum of Art. It just opened a couple of weeks ago and it'll be on until July 30th. And we're currently in discussions about it traveling, so stay tuned.
And Perrin, can you tell us where your show's going?
Sorry, we got into a side conversation. So my exhibition is currently on view at the Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. And then it will through August and opens at the Phillips Collection in Washington, DC in early October. And then its final venue is in Cincinnati next spring at the Taft Museum of Art.
Thank you again to everybody. Thank you.